Welcome to the Innate Wisdom Podcast. I'm your host, Loren Sofia, healer of my own fertility and health struggles, mother, functional fertility coach to thousands of women, and owner of Innate Fertility. I believe your body is innately wise, and so is your fertility. Sometimes we just need the tools to unlock it in abundance. I'm honored to guide you through each episode where we'll cover not just fertility, but how to rediscover the innate wisdom of your body, restore your connection with your physiology, bioenergetics, and metabolism, and get back in touch with Mother Nature and ancestral traditions. He's back. This week, I'm chatting with the one and only Morley Robbins, the founder of the Root Cause Protocol and somebody that I'm lucky enough to call one of my teachers. You absolutely loved his 2-part episode from season 1 about the things your OBGYN won't tell you. So I had to invite him back for yet another tantalizing discussion about all things fertility, pregnancy, and postpartum. And if you know Morley, tantalizing is the correct word to use here. And today we're continuing the discussion. In this episode, we're talking about what healthy hemoglobin levels really are in pregnancy, how your iron levels can actually influence your ability to breastfeed, important nutrients you need for making oxytocin, the love hormone that does way more than you probably think it does, especially when it comes to pregnancy, the truth about measuring ferritin levels and what your numbers actually mean, and so much more. We're getting into the weeds as usual with Morley, so I hope you enjoy it and have a notepad ready. Let's dive into the episode. Okay, we're back with Morley Robbins. I am so excited to have you back on the podcast, Morley. Welcome.
Well, thank you, Lauren. Delighted to be here. Looking forward to our discussion, as always.
Yeah. Well, definitely, just for you listening, if you haven't yet, go back to season 1 and listen to the podcast I originally did with Morley, where we talked about what your OBGYN won't tell you. That episode got so much feedback, really positive feedback. So if you haven't yet, definitely listen to that. But this episode, we're going to be talking about some really deep stuff, going even deeper, I think, than the topics that we covered in that podcast episode. A lot of it focuses on ceruloplasmin, which Morley will definitely explain if you've never heard that word before. But yeah, I think, Morley, what's new in your world, and do you want to kick it off?
Yeah, thank you, Lauren. It's going to be hard to keep it into like an hour, but we'll do that. We'll be fine. I mentioned to Lauren that I wanted to share something that happened just this week, just as a backdrop to this discussion. And I really worry about pregnant women and the abuse that's taking place on this planet. And so I get an email from my buddy, Ben Edwards, introducing me to a fellow physician in Chattanooga, Tennessee, who was seeking to understand what might have happened to a fellow parishioner of his in their church who was pregnant and became anemic and was given an iron infusion when she was 32 weeks pregnant. And what ended up happening was she had a brain embolism, and now she's fighting for her life. The baby had to be born 8 weeks early. So now we've got a baby who didn't get the copper download, being, pardon my expression, abused by the NICU, being bottle fed with iron and vitamin D and a bunch of synthetic B vitamins, just utter garbage. And the mom's up in the ICU. They know she has brain damage now because she was without oxygen for about 6 minutes.
Oh my gosh.
And so this entire church community now is upside down, trying to understand what happened, because she was a very healthy woman before all this took place. And so then I got into a conversation with this physician and started walking him through the facts of how minerals get downloaded from mother to baby, and how Iron is supposed to get low during the course of pregnancy. And he didn't know any of this, of course. It's not taught. And what's the meme that runs medicine? You're anemic and you're copper toxic. And it's a complete and utter lie. And I appreciate the chance to have this conversation with you, because it's any chance I get to dance on minds, but especially minds of women who are either pregnant or want to be pregnant or just have delivered, like you. It's very important that people begin to spread this gospel, because it's not understood in the medical community, the midwife community, certainly not the midwife community. Those are worse than the midwives. And then it's just, they don't know. And I sent you an email this morning that I think I may have figured out why hemoglobin goes low during the tail end of the pregnancy. I'd never understood it properly. And as you probably know it, you got to have B9 and B12 to make red blood cells. Well, most people don't know that B9 is copper dependent. Most people don't know that B12 is copper dependent. And they won't tell you that in the literature. But what I think is really entertaining is that the transport protein for B12 is called Cubilin, Cubilin. Of course, I'm going to hyphenate the Cu, right? So we can see the symbol for copper.
For those that don't know, if you're listening and you don't know what vitamin B9 is, because I think they will if you say what it is, and they'll be like, oh, because everyone goes crazy for this vitamin, and they think it's, the one vitamin that's super important to prevent neural tube defects, when there are actually several, including copper. So vitamin B9 is folate, not folic acid though either. We could do a whole other podcast about that. But
That's exactly right. No, folate is it's an incredibly misunderstood mineral, as you know, or vitamin, excuse me. But it has a mineral. It doesn't work without copper. And I stumbled across a wonderful article this morning that was describing the folate vitamin D hypothesis. And it was fascinating. We don't have time to go into it now, but it's like there's a wow factor to folate, to B9, and the many roles that it plays, not just in making blood cells, but helping to regulate a lot of things. It was quite interesting. And so you can't make or mature red blood cells without B9, folate, and B12. I'm one of those rare birds who questions whether cobalt was really the original metal in that B12. I think it was copper before they messed with it. But it turns out that when B9 and B12 are low, they create what's called macrocytic anemia. The red blood cells get big. That's a sign of poor maturation of the red blood cell. Because red blood cells start out big and they've got to get smaller in order to mature so they can move off and to do their work. And when they're missing those nutrients, they can't get to the right size. And what I didn't know, but what I learned this morning, is that when you have macrocytic anemia, you're going to have lower hemoglobin. And I guess in a way it almost makes sense, because you got bigger cells, and it was fascinating to think about that.
Less volume per unit.
Right? But what I also didn't know is that macrocytic anemia is quite common in late pregnancy. Birthing practitioners test for the type of anemia. They're just going to say, oh, you're anemic. But they're not going to say, what is it? They're not going to get into the refined understanding of the red blood cell. And what's important about the late pregnancy, as you know, is in the third trimester, mom is downloading copper, a lot of copper. As adults, we have 100 milligrams. Your son was born with 70 milligrams. That's a big bolus of copper to get from mom. Thank you, mom. And but the mom is also dealing with low hemoglobin by design, Mother Nature wants the mom to have low hemoglobin. It's called hemodilution, but it's really to help the mom make breast milk. Lower the iron, get it to the baby so the mom can actually engage in the process of making breast milk. And that's when the misdiagnosis of anemia is so prevalent. Either low hemoglobin or low ferritin. And one of my research heroes was a mom. She had three kids. Her name was Myra Fields. She was originally from Israel. And she ended up marrying a guy from England. And somehow they ended up here in the States in Washington, D.C. But she was a very gifted copper researcher. And in 1990, she wrote a very important article about copper deficiency in pregnancy. And she makes a very bold statement that ferritin, serum ferritin, is an invalid blood test during pregnancy because of the inflammatory nature of pregnancy. And people don't think about that. And what is pregnancy? It's turning a parasite in your womb into a mammal. And it's a parasite the whole time it's inside you, and it becomes a mammal when it comes out. It's a different way of thinking about your son, right?
I definitely don't think about him as a parasite, but I see what you mean.
But when he was in the womb, he was. He was an absolute parasite. And what was really high in your body that no one ever tested is hepcidin. And hepcidin responds to a parasitic growth. And guess what high hepcidin does? High hepcidin causes low ferritin. But no one's ever thought to look at it that way. And so using ferritin as a blood test for pregnant women is completely inappropriate. It should be illegal. And it's causing a lot of harm. And like I said, I don't know about this woman in Tennessee, whether it was low ferritin or low hemoglobin. It doesn't really matter. The doctor wasn't completely trained to understand what's going on. And so ferritin is not a blood test for iron vitality. As I was suggesting when we first started talking, I think it's more an indication of the immune system than the iron metabolism. And so that's not understood well. And so we have this, here we have in Chattanooga a crisis. But it's actually a crisis all over the globe because there are millions of women who are pregnant who are fearing that they're going to get anemic. And it's lack of copper that's causing the low iron. And it's a real tragedy that hopefully this conversation will help to dispel some level of disinformation that's out there. So I appreciate the chance to have this conversation.
Yeah, well, thanks for sharing all of that. I think most importantly, I think I want to acknowledge the woman. I don't know if she has a name, but
her name's Jojo.
Jojo, we're thinking about you and we are praying for you, and we hope that everything falls into place as it needs to and that you recover quickly. I'm so sorry to hear about what happened, and it is a very concerning, I think, thing that's happening in the medical system, which would never be acknowledged. But to be honest with you, Morley, I do get even doctors that are pregnant reaching out to me all the time asking, hey, my iron is low and I want to have a home birth. How can I get it up? And these are actual medically trained doctors that reach out to me, registered dietitians that reach out to me. People that the conventional medical system thinks should only have the last say, but even they don't know how to help themselves. So it's definitely a problem.
Yeah, but this mandate that hemoglobin has to be at least 12 in order to have a home birth, it's like, who made that up? Based on what study? Based on what experience? When in fact, you've got someone like Dr. Steer saying he did 150,000 live births, and the average was 8.5 to 9.5. for the healthiest babies. And where did this 12 come from? It's a mandate from on high, and it's terrorizing the world. I don't understand it. And there's no literature to back it up. And I had one client explain, well, my doctor says I need a little extra iron in case I bleed at the delivery. I said, do you know what oxytocin is? She said, well, yeah, I do know what oxytocin is. I said, do you know one of its most important jobs? Of course, it's the love hormone, right? It's the bonding hormone. No, it's the stop the bleeding hormone.
Yes.
When it gets activated, it stops bleeding.
That's
like
exactly.
that. And nobody knows that. And the synthetic form that they're using, I wonder if it's really working right.
Midwives that are doing home births will carry Pitocin with them in case there is bleeding, because it is the synthetic form of oxytocin, and that will clamp down the cervix and prevent additional blood loss. And in the hospitals as well, sometimes they will recommend, depending on how long your labor has been, or if you have any complications, sometimes they will give you Pitocin sort of like preemptively, so that when you do birth, it clamps down fast. So yeah, you're absolutely right. Oxytocin is the love hormone, but it's also the labor hormone, and it's also it's also the stop bleeding hormone. So it has many it's kind of an amazing hormone, actually, now that you said that. Now that I think about it,
it really is. That hormone led to a Nobel Prize. So it's only 9 amino acids. That's amazing. It's a really tiny little molecule, but boy, does it pack a punch. But Pitocin, why are they using Pitocin? Because they know people don't have enough copper to run the PAM enzyme to activate the precursor to activated oxytocin. That's an important thing to know. It isn't that, they can make the oxytocin, they can't activate it. And therein lies the glitch. And so it's just, maybe we know too much.
Maybe we need to figure out a different path than prescribing all these medications. Although I do think that they do serve a purpose. If you're bleeding and there's an emergency, thank God that Pitocin exists.
Oh, absolutely. Sure.
If we could make that not so needed all the time, then that'd be great too. I do want to backtrack. I have 2 questions for you. I was hoping you could clarify for everyone. You mentioned that iron gets low in the 3rd trimester to support breastfeeding. Now, do you mean that in this way? So we know that breast milk has very, very little iron in it, also very little vitamin D, but very little iron in it because it is very irritating to the baby's digestive tract. And they're basically born with a leaky gut, and it's really, really sensitive and very vulnerable. And so iron also feeds pathogens, and that's the last thing you want to do, especially with a baby, especially with somebody with leaky gut. Is that what you meant by that, or is it something else?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, and the thing is that the baby, the infant, doesn't have a functional immune system until they're about 2 years old. And that's the rationale for keeping iron out of the breast milk, is to prevent those pathogens. And the infant formula says, well, we know better than Mother Nature. And so they put significant amounts of iron and vitamin D.
And folic acid.
And folic acid, thank you. Yeah. It doesn't belong there. But this idea that people just, she's a colleague, but she's also a student. She's a lactation consultant. And she's been studying the RCP for years and finally decided to take the class. And it did not take very long for her to figure out that iron, the focus on iron in pregnancy, was what was blocking lactation following the delivery. And so her clients are all having to reorient to what's really running the show, and it's copper.
That's interesting. So she found that the women struggling with breastfeeding were the ones that were taking iron.
Absolutely.
That is very interesting.
Yep. Yeah, it's a real big issue, and it's not a popular issue because people think they need more iron. Society has been very brainwashed.
Yeah. But I could see that making sense even just from the larger perspective of it causing so much metabolic dysfunction. And if there's metabolic dysfunction, you're going to have trouble breastfeeding. So
Right.
that makes a lot of sense from that perspective. But oxytocin is what also causes the letdown as well, or triggers a letdown. In addition, there's two hormones, prolactin and oxytocin. So that goes back to what we were saying earlier, where if you are iron saturated, you're going to have trouble making the PAM enzyme because you don't have enough copper, or it's very imbalanced. So that makes a lot of sense.
For the casual listener, the PAM enzyme, which your doctor doesn't know about, was not taught about, let that sink in. I was having dinner last fall with a world-renowned neurologist and asked him what he knew about the PAM enzyme. And he leans in and he said, "The what?" And he said, "What's it stand for?" And so I gave him the 35-letter explanation. And he got really angry, not at me. And then he got really depressed when he realized his education was not complete. And not that this enzyme is important, it just activates 4,700 signaling peptides in your body. That'd be a good thing for doctors to know about, I think. I think that would be maybe day one. Let's learn how to turn on the human metabolism.
Mm-hmm.
But the problem is, then you lose the sale of 4,700 signaling peptides.
Yeah.
We live on a very funny planet, don't we?
Well, that's why they're trying to make peptides also on a completely different topic, but they're trying to make the sale of peptides like illegal, so that the pharmaceutical companies can sell it. So it's so messed up. But I did have one more question too, just based on what you said earlier too, just to clarify for everyone. You mentioned that ferritin is an inaccurate marker measuring iron, and it's more of an immune marker, and I totally agree. But I think what I would love for you to explain is to maybe elaborate on is how ferritin's actually empty and doesn't contain any iron whatsoever, which I think people would be shocked to learn.
Right.
So would you mind explaining a little bit more about that?
Sure. Ferritin is a very important molecule, as we know. It's an iron storage protein. It exists in many different states. There's something called heavy chain ferritin, which requires copper to make it work. That's typically found in the heart and the kidneys. So we got heavy chain. We have something called light chain. And light chain doesn't require copper. It runs on hydrogen peroxide as the mechanism to load iron. That would be like putting a square peg through a round hole. It's kind of what it's like. And that's found principally in the liver and the spleen. And we have what Loren is referring to called secreted ferritin, and it's found in the serum. But it's showing up in the blood because there's dysfunctional iron recycling taking place in the liver. And in the liver cells, they're called hepatocytes. There's a little stomach called the lysosome. They should just call it the stomach, right? But it's called the lysosome. And it needs certain signaling in there to recycle the iron. If the signaling is missing, the body dumps the iron into the liver, cleaves off 10 amino acids from the ferritin protein, and then secretes it into the bloodstream. And doctors see this form of ferritin in the blood thinking it's a sign of iron vitality, when in fact the ferritin is empty shotgun shells. And so when I was having a conversation with a world-renowned iron biologist a number of years ago, Douglas Kell. I asked him, I said, what's the ideal ferritin for a human being? And we're having a Zoom call. He said, 0. I about fell out of my chair. And he said, Morley, I want to make sure you understand this. He said, rising serum ferritin is not a sign of iron vitality. It's a sign of organ pathophysiology. He said, do you understand what I said? I said, absolutely. So I've read your literature, I understand. But that's like scratching the record for most people. They think that they got to get their ferritin up in order for their thyroid meds to work, or in order to keep my hair in my head, I've got to get my ferritin up. And all of that is narrative. And so those are the first 3 forms of ferritin. Let me just round out the other 2. Then we have something, there's a form of ferritin, it's called denatured ferritin, and that's found in the spleen. So ferritin can hold 4,500 atoms of iron. Denatured ferritin, also called hemosiderin, can hold 10 times more iron, so 45,000 atoms of iron. But what's important to understand is that each atom has 4 unpaired electrons. Mother Nature abhors anything that's unpaired. So 4,500 times 4 is a big number. Then multiply it times 10, you've got a lot of unpaired electrons creating foment in the spleen, which is where autoimmune conditions originate. And then there's yet a 5th form, but wait, there's more. And it's called magnetoferritin. We've never had a chance to talk about this one. But when the iron builds, so the structure of iron in these ferritins is hexagonal, 6 sides. When the iron builds and builds and builds, the structure changes to cubic, and then the power of that iron increases 200-fold, and it becomes magnetic. And the leading researchers are now implicating that magnetoferritin, which is not visible to the human eye, to a microscope, but only visible to Tesla MRI, preferably a 0.5 Tesla, not a 7 Tesla. A low-end Tesla can pick it up. And they think that this is the origin, the metabolic origin of heart disease, cancer, and neurodegeneration. Well, that's sort of a game-changing event. And all of it is because doctors just think there's one form of ferritin called serum ferritin, when in fact there's a handful of ferritins. And those are just what we know today. I'm sure that it gets more refined. But there's a lot of misunderstanding and misinformation about ferritin, and that's what leads to a lot of inappropriate decisions, especially in pregnancy.
Thanks for breaking that down. The magnetoferritin, that's new. I will definitely be looking into that. But are you basically saying that people become magnetic almost because of their iron levels? I've always thought about that. That's very interesting.
Well, it's called paramagnetic.
Yeah, well, I guess also just on the more woo-woo side of things, you know how people have different frequencies and vibrations and things like that. I wonder what that would look like if you're somebody with definitely very high iron, if that changes anything.
Well, no, I think it does. See, what's happened in the last century is a conversion of humanity over the course of, say, 3 or 4 generations, thinking that it's normal to ingest a lot of iron and thinking that it's normal to be afraid of copper. When in fact our ancestors, they didn't know about these minerals the way we're discussing now, but their foods were rich in copper and had iron, but it was back in the 1930, it was very common to get between 4 to 6 milligrams of copper in your daily diet. Milk, butter, eggs, and especially cottage cheese We're not just rich in retinol, they're rich in copper. But not today. The food system has been altered, so we're not getting the nutrients that our ancestors took for granted. They didn't know about this. They had their own set of stressors, and truth be known, our ancestors were usually either hungry or cold most of their life. We don't have those stressors. Now we have all sorts of other stressors that are equally as challenging, but people don't realize the tables have been turned as it relates to copper and iron. And I would say it's by design. Maybe it's just what a coincidence. They thought it would be a good idea to give us extra iron, and it's a good idea to take away our copper. But that's what began the downfall of human metabolism.
Hey, it's Loren here. As you know, I'm a big fan of preparing and getting ahead of potential problems before they become serious issues. If your iron levels have always been out of whack, or you're wanting to prepare your body for pregnancy to avoid iron issues, especially as you reach the 3rd trimester, which is when most women find themselves deficient, there is no better time like the present to work on this, because low iron doesn't just mean you have iron deficiency or you're deficient in iron. It can mean so much more, and things can look low but actually be high. If you're one of my course students, you know exactly what I mean. And iron dysregulation, or this imbalance in iron, can manifest as issues like hypothyroidism and endometriosis, just to name a few, which are 2 of the most common things that I help women with in my practice. And low iron in pregnancy, aka anemia of pregnancy, can also make things very complicated and lead to things like premature labor, intrauterine growth restriction, and insufficient milk syndrome, just to name a few. I personally worked on my iron levels prior to my pregnancy and ended up having stellar iron levels throughout my whole pregnancy, even as I reached the 3rd trimester, which again is typically when women are deficient or see a drop in their iron. I had barely any blood loss at delivery too, which is the most common concern around this. And I also help my students optimize their iron levels before pregnancy so that they can experience the same. If you're interested in learning how to optimize your iron levels for fertility, pregnancy, and postpartum, and prepare your body in the most intentional way possible for the most amazing pregnancy, I invite you to learn more about my program by visiting innatefertility.org/get-pregnant for more information. And if you're loving the show, don't forget to leave a review. Now back to the episode. Now, when you talk about copper, I think I want to make a distinction too. You're not just talking about copper, the mineral, but you're talking about ceruloplasmin, which is kind of the star of the show, and really, I think, the most important part of this discussion. So we mentioned earlier we would definitely be defining and explaining what ceruloplasmin is. Can you help explain what it is in a way that would help the audience understand?
Sure. Ceruloplasmin is a very big protein. So think of insulin has 45 amino acids. People probably, like we talked about, oxytocin has 9 amino acids. It's very powerful. But ceruloplasmin, which is made all over our body, but principally in the liver, it has 1,066 amino acids. And when it was originally discovered back in the 1940s, it had 8 atoms of copper inside it. So it was basically a V8. Well, today it's a V6. And I've talked to 5 different copper researchers and asked them what happened to 2 of those atoms of copper, and no one can tell me. They don't know. And they'll say, well, maybe they evaluated it. I've said, I don't think so. And they said, no, you're probably right. And for those who've ridden in a V8, a car with a V8 engine, it has more power than a V6. It's a very different ride. And this is the master antioxidant protein in the body. It's not glutathione. So you've got glutathione is the master antioxidant in the cell. Melatonin is the master antioxidant in the mitochondria. We have 40 quadrillion mitochondria in our body, and they can all make melatonin. It's not just a sleep aid. It's a master antioxidant in that organelle. But the master antioxidant for the body is ceruloplasmin, and the literature will tell you it's only found in the blood. But that's not true. It's found in tissue. It's found in the brain. It's found in the organs. It's found in the gonads. And it's playing a very, very important role to diffuse free radicals, reactive oxygen species, and that's one of its most important jobs. But it has the ability to transform its function. And if you've seen movies about the Transformers, those Transformers can change shape. Well, ceruloplasmin can change shape and function, and I think it's a sentient part of our body. It's really intelligent. What's I think particularly important as it relates to pregnancy is that so let me back up. The normal level of ceruloplasmin in a healthy adult would be around 30, and the ideal copper would be around 100. And so the ratio of copper to ceruloplasmin would be 3.33. But as soon as a woman becomes pregnant, those numbers shoot up. Her copper can go up into the 200s, and ceruloplasmin can go up into the 90s. It's really quite high. And so no doctor that I know of ever tests for ceruloplasmin or copper. Well, in fact, that's what's running the show. And when you get into the placenta, which is supposed to be a very vibrant reddish brown organ, there are 3 copper proteins that are running that organ. It's known as the forgotten organ, probably the most important organ in the human body, but it's called the forgotten organ for a reason. But there's 3 copper proteins that are found there: ceruloplasmin, hephaestin, which is a cousin to ceruloplasmin, and the one that's most intriguing of all is called zyklopene, Zyklopen. Your doctors never talk to you about those 3 proteins. But what those 3 proteins do is run and regulate the movement of copper and iron between mom and baby. And I'd say the most important of all is zyklopene, because that's how the baby gets iron from mom. If zyclopene's not working right, there isn't going to be adequate iron transfer to the baby. And if doctors aren't thinking about copper, if doctors aren't measuring copper status, then I think the chances of mistakes or misunderstandings or malfunction are going to go up exponentially. And I think that's what we're witnessing in obstetrics all over the globe. So the ceruloplasmin protein, one of its most important jobs is it can regulate both oxygen and iron at the same time. Why is that important? Well, iron is the master pro-oxidant on the planet. 36% of the Earth's composition is iron. It's not our friend. Can't live without it. It carries the oxygen, carries the CO2, but in my humble opinion, it's dumber than a box of rocks. And oxygen is the second most reactive element on the planet after fluorine gas. And so what happens when you put oxygen next to iron? They create rust. We're really good at it. And that rusting process takes place inside our body. But what prevents that rusting process is this copper protein, ceruloplasmin. And here's the catch. There's always a catch. I'm 6 feet tall. How tall are you, Lauren?
I'm 5'6".
Okay, 5'6". Well, that means that I'm smarter than you, right? I must have higher IQ. No, that doesn't mean it. Height does not mean anything to IQ, does it? And so there's two ways to measure the ceruloplasmin protein. You can measure its level, which is its height, 30, 90, when you're pregnant, things like that. That's its level. But the IQ of ceruloplasmin is the activity of its enzymes. And this most important enzyme is called ferroxidase, ferro, iron, oxidase, oxygen. It's working with oxygen. And so that's the enzyme that's regulating oxygen and iron. And there's a $4 test that can be done. It's called the ferroxidase colorimetric assay, $4 test that is not allowed by the FDA because they don't want doctors or their patients knowing what's really going on with the copper enzymes. Now, this isn't just ceruloplasmin. I've identified 5 copper enzymes that would reveal how smart the copper is in the body, and what a coincidence, all 5 are blocked by the FDA. So we're allowed to know how tall we are, but we're not allowed to know how smart we are. And that, to me, is a crime against humanity. And it's, to me, the most glaring defect in medical education is one not recognizing copper, not understanding copper, but not being allowed to measure its intelligence. And folks, we wouldn't be here on this planet if copper weren't here, because it's what allows us to exist in the presence of oxygen, which is a very reactive element, and it needs to be regulated, and copper is what runs that show. And so it's not something that's openly discussed, or and there's no interaction with your doctor. Hey doc, how's my ceruloplasmin today? They wouldn't even know what you're talking about. And that's the Achilles heel of organized medicine, is not knowing about the bioavailability and the intelligence of copper enzymes.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for breaking that down. I think, as you can tell, ceruloplasmin is very, very important. And so it's not just about copper, but it's being able to make ceruloplasmin. And we'll talk about how to do that later. But you touched on why ceruloplasmin is important for pregnancy. You touched on why ceruloplasmin is important for lactation as well. Do you want to add anything to those specific sort of like times in women's lives?
Well, I mean, ceruloplasmin is playing in the background of the pregnancy. And again, it's not openly known, it's not openly taught. My 2 favorite quotes, and we probably talked about this in our first session, but my 2 favorite quotes about pregnancy, one is from Mildred Seeley, a physician who is also a mom, and her famous quote about magnesium is, "Pregnancy is a magnesium deficient state from start to finish." The whole time you're pregnant, you're magnesium deficient. When was the last time your doctor measured your magnesium status? Never. So they don't measure magnesium, they don't measure copper, they don't measure ceruloplasmin, and they don't measure retinol. And what's important for people to understand is that retinol, vitamin A, is what activates what are called copper pumps to make ceruloplasmin and to make a whole bunch of other copper enzymes that people don't know about. So ceruloplasmin is playing this critical role throughout our lives, but especially during pregnancy. But the other quote that I absolutely love is from a famous alpine physiologist. His name was Sir Joseph Barcroft. He was British and started his career studying mountain climbers and ended his career studying infants or in utero fetuses, and discovered that they have the exact same state of hypoxia, whether you're at the top of Mount Everest or inside the womb. And his famous quote is, "Pregnancy is Mount Everest in utero." So the oxygen level is very low inside the womb, and that creates stress for the growing fetus. You got to have copper to deal with that. It's very, very important. And some people might be aware of or maybe even worried about preeclampsia. Preeclampsia is when you have protein in the urine, you have swelling, you have increased blood pressure, right? And hypertension. Those are the four cornerstones of preeclampsia, and they're all related to rising uric acid. So what is uric acid? Well, think of uric acid as billowing black smoke coming out of your mitochondria because they're not burning oxygen properly. Why aren't they burning oxygen properly? Because they don't have enough copper. And the go-to solution to preeclampsia, the doctor will slide in at the last second and give the mother a bag of magnesium chloride or magnesium sulfate. Well, that's like throwing a wet blanket on a 10-alarm fire. A little bit too late and a little bit too little. And so because doctors don't measure copper and ceruloplasmin and vitamin A and magnesium throughout the 9 months of the pregnancy, they come in like this at delivery, hoping to work their way through it. Like, I don't think that's very professional. And I've witnessed 4 births in my former marriage, so I didn't know any of this stuff. If I had known this stuff, oh my gosh, God help the obstetricians that I was interacting with, because I actually, well, I'll just leave it at that. I would be much more interactive with them, and I'm trying to restrain myself, Loren. You know that, but we just don't know these basic fundamental facts of physiology, and it's affecting the lives of not just the fetus and the baby when it comes out, but the mom and the dad and the family and the community, and it begins to reverberate out, especially if there's a problem. And so preeclampsia is completely avoidable. All you got to do is measure level of uric acid in the blood. It's very easy to measure. And you can tell right away if it's starting to rise, you've got a metabolic problem and the oxygen is not being burned properly, and it can be corrected. So it's just this idea of just wondering, why do I have this gestational diabetes? Because you don't have enough copper. It's not mystery. It's in the literature. But it's not discussed openly in obstetrical circles. So it's, why do I have protein in the urine? Same reason. Why do I have hypertension? Well, there's a whole series of signaling peptides, ding, 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 back to PAM. If they don't get activated, they don't signal, and you get hypertension. And so it's tragic to see so many people kept in the dark, not the least of which are the practitioners. And I think if they knew this information, they would respond. I have absolute certainty that they are anxious to know. They're just not being trained completely. And so I think that the importance of ceruloplasmin is vast, and it needs to become a cornerstone of obstetrics, but it's going to be a while before that happens, just because it has such a significant effect on retooling and re-educating so many practitioners involved in the birthing process.
Yeah, there's so much to be learned. I think that things are shifting slowly, but slowly. So, but I agree. And, just to talk about preeclampsia for a second, my mother had preeclampsia twice, once with me and once with my youngest brother. And it was so bad with my youngest brother that she had to give birth 2 months early. She had an emergency C-section. So that was something that I personally worked very hard at preparing and trying to mitigate all risk factors. And it's something that I also teach my students as well, is how to kind of put your best foot forward, understand what the risk factors are and where you're personally sort of vulnerable to kind of really help put your best foot forward and come into pregnancy, strengthening those weak spots. So we covered pregnancy, we covered lactation. Would you mind talking or touching on quickly sort of how ceruloplasmin plays into fertility as well?
Yeah. Mhm. So it turns out that when the egg and the sperm meet, there's kind of like a little explosion, spark of life. But there's also there's a lot of oxidative stress that needs to be overcome in order for that union to take place. And so again, think of that oxidative stress as like static in a radio. And when you got the signal just right, the static goes down. Well, that's what ceruloplasmin does, is make sure that the signal is just right and that the resistance to the bonding can take place as it's supposed to. Absent that signaling, absent that regulation of the signal, there's going to be more resistance that the egg and the sperm have to overcome in order to complete the union. And that's really the basis of infertility and it can be either the father or the mom can have that increased static. And animal farmers know that if their animals are not producing offspring properly, there's only one nutrient they add to the feed, and it's copper. And so it would certainly simplify the process for people to know that, as opposed to going to fertility clinics, spending a lot of money for in vitro fertilization. So there's a very simple explanation for where the breakdown is, and then when you think you're infertile, it becomes an emotional issue. Then there's an energetic issue that has to be overcome, and there's fear that starts to get in the way. And when we're in a state of fear, we got to spell it right, Fe-AR, so we can see the symbol for iron. And then the word becomes iron attracts rust. And when we're in a state of fear, we become a magnet for iron. And guess what iron does? It increases oxidative stress. So then it just compounds the challenge of allowing the pregnancy to take place.
Yeah, vicious cycle.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And, as far as like egg quality, for example, you have to be able to create energy to maintain your eggs, not only the quality, but the number of them too. So, as well as sperm, there's so much in regards to sperm motility issues, in addition to sperm morphology issues, which are more, kind of like the quality type stuff. But if your sperm can't move the rate that they need to, then that's a problem. They're never going to be able to meet the egg by the time they, perish.
They won't get there.
So, yeah, it's definitely a huge issue, and it's more upfront too. And so I love that you shared that. I think it's so important for anyone trying to conceive, and this conversation is important for anyone also pregnant or, thinking about breastfeeding. So we talked about how to test ceruloplasmin levels earlier. You can get a blood draw, right?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Exactly. Real quick, let me just build on what you were just saying about the egg and the sperm. Make sure that it's important for the listeners to understand that we have 40 quadrillion mitochondria in our body. So that's 15 zeros. That's a lot of mitochondria. And we can go back to our high school biology textbook and remember the picture of the cell, and there were like maybe 2 or 3 mitochondria. But we didn't know that Walt Disney drew that picture. It has nothing to do with reality. And so the average cell has 500 mitochondria, but the average mature egg in a woman's body can have anywhere from 100,000 mitochondria up to 600,000 mitochondria. I'm going to guess that the 600,000 is when the woman is younger, the 100,000 is as they age, or depending on how healthy they are. But a woman who has an egg with 600,000 mitochondria is going to be just pumping out energy to ensure a vital union and a vital growth process. The difference is that I think that the sperm only has 1 or 2 mitochondria, but there's billions of sperm. But they've got to be healthy, as Loren was pointing out, in order to last long enough to make it up to meet the egg. So we need to visualize these mitochondria as really, really important aspects of the fertility issue, both for the mom and the dad. But when you think about the mom needing to produce hundreds of thousands of mitochondria per egg, well, that begins to increase the order of magnitude of importance about healthy diet, healthy lifestyle, things like that.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Thanks for elaborating on that too. I think it's really important to just understand the vast sort of like sizable difference between certain cells, and that really helps paint the picture in terms of the number of mitochondria they require. So we talked about testing, we talked about what to look for kind of in terms of the results. Can we talk about now, because everyone's probably wondering, how can you support your ceruloplasmin levels? And is there anything you need to avoid that could potentially diminish ceruloplasmin levels?
Well, what we talk about within the root cause protocol are a series of what are called stops and starts, nutrients that you want to avoid, nutrients that you want to embrace. And this is part of the ongoing principles of the RCP. People interested in this can certainly download the handbook. Go to the RCP123.org handbook. I think it's like over 80 pages long now, but it's very user-friendly. But it will very quickly show you who the stops and starts are. And I think this is where people get surprised when some of the most important stops are: stop taking zinc, stop taking iron, stop taking calcium, vitamin D, ascorbic acid. Well, a lot of people think those are the mainstays for good health, but they are very disruptive to your ceruloplasmin status. So if you don't know about ceruloplasmin, then you'll be less likely to do that. But if you're really trying to strengthen your ceruloplasmin, you want to make sure you avoid those, but make sure that you're focusing on minerals in general, and magnesium, bioavailable copper. So what's that? That's copper with retinol. Very, very important combination. And you want to have, wherever possible, natural sources of B vitamins. And these are the factors, and there are others, but those sort of the critical factors that will ensure the vitality of the ceruloplasmin protein that's going to really drive the vitality of the individual.
Yeah, definitely download the handbook. I'll put the link in the show notes. But yeah,
Okay.
it's, getting more of those nutrients. A lot of foods, liver, shellfish, bee pollen, real protein like meat, high quality, full fat dairy. Like those are just a couple of things that you can incorporate. Eggs with the yolks. So those are a lot of the things. And even just doing that can take your health into a much better place, including your fertility. But also, if you're struggling with iron deficiency anemia in pregnancy, so pregnancy anemia, and you're not eating those things, or you're eating even more of like a plant-based diet, you may see that your iron levels are not where you want them to be, even though those can be very controversial, as we discussed. But, it's really important. I know that I ate a lot of these foods during my pregnancy, And Morley, I had shockingly little bleeding when I delivered my baby.
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me.
My iron and copper and all the metabolism there was excellent. I recovered really well. I had barely any blood loss. My placenta was so healthy. It was really cool to see. It was
That's
so
beautiful.
deep in color. Yeah. And I have the energy to keep up with my infant son who doesn't sleep, even though I'm running on negative hours of
You're running on
sleep.
vapors.
I'm
That's
running
right.
on vapors.
No,
But yeah.
and think about your mom had preeclampsia twice,
Mm-hmm.
but you had a very different experience. And
Yes.
you could argue that if a mom has a weakness like that, you would expect it to play out in the next generation. You didn't experience that. So
Yeah.
that's beautiful. It's a real testament that you can reverse these conditions. You can overcome them, which is really what the RCP is all about.
Yeah. That's something I truly believe. I don't think we're destined, just because your mom had this or just because, your sister had this or, this runs in your family, you're not destined to have this issue too. So I truly believe that the body's very capable of healing. It just needs to be given the right tools. So, and that goes for not just fertility, pregnancy, lactation, postpartum, but also just general issues regarding health too.
Yeah. Well, I think people need to know that these nutrients are really critical. And I think they go well beyond the prenatals. I'm not a huge fan of prenatals, as you know, but I think people need to know that even a good prenatal, what's considered a good, is not enough to address what Loren and I are speaking to here right now. So it's time to rethink and broaden your understanding of what's going on. So
Yeah. Maybe I'll do an episode on prenatals because I have so many thoughts about them. I
yeah,
just
I
think
bet you do.
people,
Yeah.
yeah, people need to be more informed about what they, it's just everything about them. Because I think a lot of us are sold, really, it's a lot of it's marketing. But yeah, maybe
Yeah,
I'll do that.
that's right.
I'll make a book. But yeah, thank you so much, Morley. This was such an amazing conversation. I hope that it has been enlightening for everyone. Definitely, everyone, send your thoughts to JoJo, prayers to JoJo. And, I think hopefully you've gotten a lot out of this conversation. So I would love to ask you two more questions. If somebody was
Sure,
trying
absolutely.
to improve their health based on this conversation, what's one thing that they can start doing today?
Put aside the internet folklore about what's considered good nutrition that includes vitamin D and iron and ascorbic acid and things of that nature. And I think the other thing would be there is wisdom in your ancestors eating organ meats. They're not easy to find, the liver, or the heart, or the kidney, but they're very rich with nutrients and energy. And I would encourage people to go beyond meat, but get to organ meats. Would be a very important step for them to improve their health.
I think that's great advice. That alone can make such a huge difference. So find a local farmer or a local butcher who sources organ meats from a reputable place. I would say pasture raised organ meats are definitely very different than conventionally raised organ meats. They taste
Oh,
so
yeah.
different, they smell so different. So if you've tried organ meats and you haven't liked it, give pasture raised a chance because the difference is incredible. It's so much sweeter, so much more palatable. It's actually good tasting versus not so good tasting. So thank you for that, Morley. And then lastly, how can people find you and support your work?
Certainly online with the Magnesium Advocacy Group. We have an RCP community, again, rcp123.org. Through the training program, we have an RCP Institute. I'd love to have your followers be a part of that. We're enrolling right now for for class number 20, which is very exciting.
Wow.
And then for those who really want, yeah, I know. For those who want to reach out to me personally, I always give out my email address, which is my first and last name at gmail.com. And then for those brave few that want to talk to me, my phone number is area code 847-922-8061. And the highlight of my day, I get several calls a day, but the highlight of my day are the people that call expecting me not to answer. And I always answer my phone. And the response on the other end is always hypoxia. Oh my God, you do answer your phone. If I had $1 for every time someone said that, I could retire yesterday. No, I just love that kind of in vivo experience of like, oh my gosh, he is accessible. So I'm happy to have that conversation and appreciate the chance to have this dialogue with you, Loren, and look forward to others that we might have going forward. But these are important topics that are not always the easiest to have, but I think people are at a point now where they need to know these important facts so they can just begin to catapult their health going forward.
Absolutely, yes. And I'm super appreciative of your time. I know those of you listening are also appreciative of your time. It's always a pleasure. And I love how you have a gift for breaking things down in such a palatable way, digestible way. I really appreciate what you're doing, Morley.
Well, great. Well, I'm loving what I'm doing, and I'm going to keep doing it for as long as I can. So I appreciate the chance to share this information.
All right, awesome. Well, thank you so much, Morley. We'll talk soon. Thank you so much for listening to the Innate Wisdom Podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, please leave us a review and share the podcast with someone who you think might benefit. If you're new here, we can't recommend enough that you take advantage of my free resources, like the Get Pregnant Yesterday checklist, Cycle Literacy Guide, Prenatal Primer, and Sperm Booster Manual. And if you're trying to conceive now or in the near future, I invite you to join my pregnancy prep e-course, Conscious Inception. Make sure to follow me on Instagram too, at innate_fertility, and consider joining my newsletter to receive exclusive content related to fertility and so much more. A friendly reminder, the content shared on this podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be a substitute for the advice provided by your doctor or other healthcare professional. It is not intended to be, nor does it constitute healthcare or medical advice.